Hey, I'm Tyler. In this video, we're going to talk about the most important chemistry topics that you need to know for the TEAS. We'll look at some practice questions on these topics so you can figure out how well you know the stuff and you can figure out what you might need to study. As we work through the problems, I'll share some tips, tricks, and advice for the TEAS, and we'll talk about how to organize and prioritize your studying so that you can quickly raise your score if you need to. Okay? Now, I'm focusing on the most important chemistry topics here because I want to give you a clear plan for studying. Let me tell you what doesn't work, okay? A lot of people are really worried about the chemistry part of the TEAS, okay? They freak out, they feel like this guy, they order tons of books, they spend hours and days watching like every TEAS video that they can find on YouTube, and you know what? Many of them end up learning pretty much nothing. It's like all this craziness, all this work, like doesn't even help them on the TEAS. A total waste of time. Okay, we're going to do the exact opposite, right? We're going to get rid of all of this stuff, all the stuff that is stressing you out, and we're going to replace it with a simple step-by-step plan. Okay, let me show you. Okay. The TEAS might cover tons of different chemistry topics. The stuff that I put here, it's just some of the chemistry topics that might show up on the TEAS. Okay? If you're starting from scratch, if you never took chemistry before, or you took a chemistry class in high school like a million years ago or whatever, learning all this stuff would literally take months. And this is one of the reasons why people get so stressed out about chemistry on the TEAS, because it's like it would take you months to learn everything from scratch. And most people, even if you want to do that, most people don't have months to spend. All right. So it's like, of course, it feels completely overwhelming. Well, here's the thing. This is really interesting. Okay. I've studied the TEAS. I have looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of official ATI questions. Okay. And I've discovered that many of these topics, these ones that you see in red and yellow here, almost never show up on the TEAS, or they only sometimes show up, like very rarely. And so the problem here is you might spend weeks or months studying all these topics here, and then you take the TEAS and you only see like one question on all the stuff, or maybe not even a question at all, right? So here's the thing. If you ignore all these topics that almost never show up, there's a much smaller group of topics that almost always show up and are really easy to learn, okay? These are what I consider the most important topics, all right? They almost always show up and they're easy to learn. That's what we are going to focus on here. Okay? If you're getting ready to take the TEAS, it's really, really important to focus on these topics first. Okay? And if you don't know this stuff, you can raise your score very, very quickly by focusing on these topics. I always say, don't worry about anything else until you can crush these topics. After you learn these, you can move on to more advanced topics if you want, but don't try to focus on everything all at the same time, okay? Focus on the basics, focus on the stuff that almost always shows up and is easy to learn. Then move on later if you want, okay? Now listen, full disclosure, I have a course that teaches all of these high priority TEAS topics. I teach patiently and step by step. I try to teach this information so that it's crystal clear, so that even if you've never taken a chemistry class in your life, it will make sense. You'll be able to feel yourself learning, okay? I think my videos are awesome. I think they're better than anything else out there. You can start watching them for free. Check them out at teasinOneday.com. I can promise you're going to feel yourself learning, okay? So check them out. Anyway, going back to this list of high priority topics, let's find out how well you know them. Okay, let's see, how prepared are you? We'll do a bunch of practice problems to help you figure this out. Okay, First up, two very important topics: states of matter and state changes. I consider these like the absolute highest priority, okay? If you learn nothing else for chemistry on the T's, you should learn these two topics, okay? That's because they always show up. I think they're pretty easy to learn, and you can learn them pretty quickly. Okay, here's the first question. In which of the following states of matter do the particles have vibrational kinetic energy and the highest translational kinetic energy? Now, you'll probably want to pause the video for a minute, read the answer choices, and figure out which you're going to choose, okay? And the answer is C, gas. The particles in a gas are vibrating. That's where you get the vibrational kinetic energy. But much more important, they're flying around really fast. That is the high translational kinetic energy, or we can call it high translational motion. So for the T's, it's really important to know how the particles move in solid, liquid, and gas. Problems like this show up all the time. Okay, here's another question. Heat is absorbed during which of the following processes? Select all that apply. And the answers are A, boiling, E, melting, and F, sublimation. These are all phase changes, okay, where the particles start moving faster and faster. They start moving further apart. And so you have to put energy in, or you have to put heat in to make these phase changes happen. It's really important to know the 6 main phase changes for the T's and to know lots of stuff about them, right? Like, do they absorb or release heat? How do the particles move during those phase changes? Stuff like that. T's loves that information. Now look, I'm going to stop right here. If you struggled with these first 2 questions, you might be freaking out, but it's no big deal, okay? It just means there's some stuff you got to learn. But honestly, there's lots of good news. Let me explain. Because if you got these first 2 questions wrong, or you didn't even know how to answer them in the first place, right? Now you know exactly what you need to do to start raising your score, okay? The stuff about states of matter, state changes, it's pretty basic. You can learn it really fast. Even if you're just starting from scratch. In about an hour, you can learn this stuff, right? You can learn this stuff, and it almost always shows up on the T's, okay? And if you need to learn this stuff, I have videos that will walk you patiently and step by step through the information. You can find them at teasinOneday.com. But the point is, states of matter and state changes are the first topics to focus on. Learn this stuff. It will help boost your score and then come back for more. Okay? Now, after you've mastered state changes, states of matter, the second priority is atoms. Okay? Atoms always, always, always show up in the T's. And there's so many ways that the T's might ask questions about atoms. So let's look at 2 examples to see how well you know this stuff. Okay. Which of the following statements is correct? Take a minute and read all these choices carefully. And the answer is D. Electrons reside in orbitals and have less mass than neutrons. One thing you just got to know for the T's is the structure of atoms and the characteristics or properties of the subatomic particles. And watch out for choice C here, okay? A lot of people pick that by mistake. Protons and neutrons, they do have equivalent masses, as you can see here, but they don't have opposite charges, okay? Protons have a charge of +1, but neutrons have a charge of 0. That's not opposite, okay? The T's is always trying to trick you, so you really, really got to know your stuff. Next question here. An ion of SN120 has a charge of +4. Which of the following is a true statement about this ion? You are almost guaranteed to see a question very, very, very similar to this on the TEAS. So give it a minute or two and try to figure it out. And the answer is D. It has 70 neutrons and 46 electrons. Let me show you how we solve a problem like this. I'm going to show you really fast, okay? If you don't know how to do this, I'm not going to be teaching it step by step here, okay? But I want to show you what goes into solving a question like this because so many people study the wrong stuff, okay? They're not learning the skills that will help them solve a problem like this. So let me show you what you have to be able to do. Okay, here's the process. We know that SN, or tin, has 50 protons because the atomic number is 50. We get that from the periodic table. Now, the mass number is 120. We get that from the isotope name here. Now, 120, that's the total number of protons and neutrons. So, 120 minus 50 gives us 70 neutrons. Okay, that's the number of neutrons. Next, what about the electrons? Well, since the ion has a charge of +4, it must have 4 more protons than electrons, which means it has 46 electrons. And there you have it, 70 neutrons, 46 electrons, choice D. Now, if you had trouble with that question, you got to make sure that you learn how to do that kind of thing for the TEAS. Okay, but if you're having trouble with it and you've been studying, I think I might know why this was challenging, okay? A lot of people spend time memorizing lots of definitions for the test, okay? Stuff like atomic number and atomic mass, and maybe they're studying from a book. They see those words or terms in boldface, and so they think they should be memorizing them. Or maybe they watched a YouTube video where somebody was like, now be sure to memorize this, okay? But honestly, memorizing definitions doesn't really help because for the TEAS, you got to be able to answer math questions like the one that I showed you here, right? Definitions you've memorized, they don't really help. You got to know what to add and subtract and what numbers you need to compare, stuff like that, right? If you can't work through a problem the way I showed you, you just haven't learned the important stuff yet. Okay, so make sure you're learning the right things. Okay, and listen, solving problems like this takes practice, right? You got to do it a bunch of times. You can't just watch somebody, do it once or twice, right? You've really got to do it yourself a bunch of times. But the good thing is there are so many different ways that the TEAS might try to ask you questions like this. If you understand the basics, if you understand the fundamentals, you'll be able to crush like anything that they throw at you, okay? Practice is going to make perfect, so make sure that you understand this information about atoms. And if you struggled with it, you should stop and master it before you worry about anything else, right? It's so common on the TEAS. Learning this stuff will be like one of the fastest ways you can raise your score. Atoms are super common. I think they're pretty easy to learn. So you can go to my website, TEAS in One Day, watch videos that walk you through all this. We'll go step by step and do lots of practice. And in about an hour and a half, 2 hours, I really think this information will be crystal clear. And you'll be able to answer like any question about atoms that the TEAS wants to throw at you. Okay, so let's step back for a second, okay? Depending on what score you need, these 3 topics we just talked about are so common and so important, they might be all you need to pass the TEAS. Now, I don't know. It depends what score you want, okay? But for plenty of people, these 3 chemistry topics are all they need to get over the hump and get a passing score, okay? And you can learn all of it in about 2.5, 3 hours, okay? Now, after you've mastered states of matter, state changes, and atoms, what next? Well, in my opinion, I think you should then tackle these next topics in this order, okay? I got them right here. Check them off one by one. Each topic will give you more information that you need to answer questions that you might see on the teas. And I've tried to organize these in order of most important to least important, okay? So it's like if you only have 2 or 3 more hours, then start here, do this one and this one and this one to get the most bang for your buck. Okay, that's how I've tried to organize these. Okay, so it's like the highest priorities are first. You're not wasting any time. Okay, now, after you've finished these essentials, if you finish all of them, then you can move on to more advanced topics. You know, some of that stuff that we talked about at the beginning of the video, right? These advanced topics are a little harder to learn. They usually show up much less often. But here's the important thing. For some people, they really want to get the highest score that they can. So they're going to need to dive into those more advanced topics. But for other folks, these basics are all they need to get the score they want. And of course, as we said just a minute ago, maybe these are all you need. If you don't need a super high score to pass, you just want to get a little boost to get over the hump, maybe you just need these. But anyway, even if you want a score that's quite high, this is the foundation that you're going to need. Then you can raise your score even more, move on to advanced topics as well. But regardless, make sure you know these basics. Okay, so let's go step by step through this list. I'll give you some examples of questions on these other topics so you can see how well you know them. We'll try to figure out whether you're ready or whether you need to brush up your information a little bit more, and I'll try to give you advice as we go too. So first off, compounds and reactions. You'll want to know stuff like elements and compounds, chemical formulas, and chemical reactions. Here is an example problem, okay? Ethene, C2H4, is a hydrocarbon gas that combines with oxygen gas in a combustion reaction. Which of the following unbalanced equations correctly shows this reaction? And the correct answer is A. Now, you might be thinking, you might feel like this guy here, and you might be thinking, oh my goodness, that seems so hard. There is so much stuff I got to learn. Well, yes, there is some stuff that you got to learn, but you can save a ton of time if you learn the TEAS tricks. The TEAS is always trying to trick you. And if you know how they do it, you can outsmart them. For this problem, listen to this. You don't need to know the right answer, okay? You just have to be able to get rid of the wrong ones. Let me show you, okay? Here's how we could do it, okay? The question says that ethene combines with oxygen gas. Now, look at all the equations. Most of them show ethene combining with something. Okay, here we have ethene plus O2, ethene plus O. But in C, ethene isn't combining with anything. There's no plus anything. There's nothing there. It's just ethene and an arrow. So that can't possibly be right because ethene's not combining with anything. So go ahead and cross it off. We can get rid of C, one down. Next, the question says that ethene combines with oxygen gas. I talk a lot in my videos about the small list of chemicals that you must know for the TEAS because they unlock so many questions, okay? Oxygen gas is one of them. It's right here. And oxygen gas is always O2. The formula for oxygen gas is O2, not O, O2. So look, choices B and D have O instead of O2. But oxygen gas is always O2. So B and D must be wrong. The only one that's left is A. That's the right answer. So I always say you could spend hours and hours and days and weeks memorizing everything, or you can learn the tricks so that you can outsmart the TEAS. I want to help you crush the TEAS. So I'll show you all these tricks in my videos, teasinOneday.com. One more thing. When it comes to chemical reactions and chemical equations, people always ask, should I worry about balancing equations? Should I learn this stuff? Well, look, Here's how I'd answer that question. Here's my opinion. Balancing equations does show up on the T's. Not always, but frequently. But, I think balancing equations can be a little tricky to learn, and it does take some practice to get the hang of it. So my advice is master all these basics first, and then double back to balancing equations. I have a video to help you learn balancing equations when the time is right. But you should know, learning balancing equations only helps you solve one type of problem, okay? Whereas learning these basics over here, that's going to get you ready for many, many types of questions. So I always say, focus on these, learn all the stuff before you move on to balancing chemical equations. Our next topic is catalysts and enzymes. There's a little bit of overlap with life science and biology here, okay? But that's great, right? This means that what you learn for the chemistry section can also raise your score for the life science section. Here is a question. An enzyme is a biological catalyst. Which of the following are true statements about enzymes? Select all that apply. And the answers are A and C. Look, this is classic T's being tricky, okay? There are a bunch of things that you need to know about enzymes and catalysts. But these are two things you got to know. They increase the rate or speed of reaction, and they decrease the activation energy of a reaction. For the T's, I always say, this is like one of my catchphrases, focus on what you know. If you've learned the basics of enzymes, you should know that they increase the rate of reaction and they decrease the activation energy of a reaction. There's other stuff to know too, but those are like two of the most important things. Okay, these statements are key. Now, these other choices, chances are you have no idea. They look scary. You don't know if they're right or not. So don't pick them. All right, don't pick them. Once you've learned the basics of enzymes, you can recognize that A and C are correct. Do not be distracted by the other choices. That's just the T's trying to trick you. Focus on what you know. Okay, next up, acids and bases. Questions on acids and bases are so common, and the T's asks about them in so many ways. We'll do two different questions here. Okay. In the laboratory, a student creates 4 different solutions, each of which has a different pH value. In which of the solutions is the concentration of hydroxide ions the highest? And the answer is D, pH 12. It's so important to know the basics of the pH scale. All this information that you see here, it always shows up on the T's, okay? And with a pH, math can get complicated and tricky. Equations like this, things like this with tenfold, 100, 1,000. Too many people get hung up on trying to learn this complicated stuff, and they don't master the basics. They don't end up learning the complicated stuff either, but they spend all this time like memorizing equations they don't need and equations they don't understand, and they don't learn the basics, okay? So then they can't even answer questions like this. So the more advanced pH math can come later if you want to go there. But basics like this are super, super important to learn, and you can learn it pretty quickly. So I always say, focus on the basics first. Here's another question about acids and bases. This one is about buffers. Which of the following is a true statement about buffers? Read them over for a sec. We're going to do something a little bit different here. So I want to show you how to attack this, okay? Because this question is just like classic T's. It looks terrifying. They're throwing all sorts of scary information at you, stuff that you've like probably never ever seen before. But if you know the basics of buffers, right? If you know they maintain pH, you can immediately eliminate 3 of these choices, okay? Don't get distracted by all this extra scary information, okay? A, B, and C are not how buffers work, okay? D is the only correct answer that works. You don't have to know the specifics of any of this. It's just like if you know the basics of buffers, you can read these answer choices over and you can know that A, B, and C cannot possibly be right. And because of that, D, even if you don't know the specifics, even if you've never seen these chemicals before at pH 7, it's like, what the heck is that? It doesn't matter because you know that A, B, and C have to be wrong. You'll know that if you learn the basics of buffers so that you know D must be right. Okay, up next, basic periodic table and basic chemical bonding. These topics really go together, okay? You can't really learn one without the other. So that's why I've kind of lumped them together here, and we'll be looking at 2 related examples. Now, when I talk about these topics, I always focus on the basic part. Gotta learn the basic fundamentals. And that's because many books and videos out there for the TEAS, they get totally lost in the details, all right? And people end up not learning the basics, which are what is most important for the TEAS, okay? Here's what I mean by a basic chemical bonding question, okay? Ones like this show up all the time. The common organic solvent, carbon tetrafluoride, is composed of 1 carbon atom bonded to 4 fluorine atoms. Which of the following correctly describes how a carbon-fluorine bond forms in carbon tetrafluoride? Read over these answer choices and see if you can answer it. And the answer is D. Carbon and fluorine share 2 electrons. How do we know? Well, we have carbon and fluorine, a nonmetal and another nonmetal. So they're doing covalent bonding, which means they are sharing electrons. Super important to know your metals and nonmetals so you can recognize when they come together in different combinations. Now, what about choice C? Well, in covalent bonding, atoms never share just 1 electron. So that's a choice where the TEAS is trying to trick you. Atoms might share 2 electrons. They might share more than 2 electrons, but since more than 2 isn't an option here, you know it's not going to be 1. You can cross that off, you can eliminate it, and the only one that works here is choice D. I say this a lot. I know I say this a lot, but it's so true. If you understand the basics and the most important topics, you can answer a question like this in 10 seconds. But if you get focused on all the details when you're studying, you're memorizing all these definitions that you don't understand, you're probably not learning the basics. So when you see a problem like this, you're probably not going to be able to answer, right? So don't focus on memorizing definitions you don't understand. Don't focus on watching videos where they're saying all this jargon that doesn't make any sense. That's not going to help you. Focus on the basics that you can understand and that help you solve problems like this. Now, let's move on to the periodic table. Okay, speaking of which, when it comes to the periodic table, people always ask me, should I memorize the periodic table? The number of times people have asked me this, okay? Because, maybe they watched some YouTube video where the person was be sure to memorize every square on the periodic table, or there's some Facebook group where people were what you got to do is you got to memorize every square of the periodic table. So many people tell you to do that for the TEAS, okay? Should you do it? No. It is a total and colossal waste of time. If anyone tells you to memorize the periodic table for the TEAS, just don't even trust anything else that they say, right? It's they're just so wildly off base. They tell you to memorize the periodic table, they can't possibly be giving you good advice about what you need to do to pass a TEAS. You don't have to listen to my advice, but somebody tells you to memorize the periodic table, just don't listen to their advice, okay? Just find another person to learn from, okay? it would take you hours and days, like, I don't know, maybe like weeks to like memorize all the squares of the periodic table, right? And in the same amount of time, you could learn like tons of chemistry that you'd need to pass the exam, and it wouldn't even help you that much, right? Because there are specific things that the TEAS will ask you about the periodic table, but it's not going to be like, you're not going to learn them by like memorizing all the squares. Okay, so let me show you an example of the kind of question that you'll need to be able to answer about the periodic table, and it's not going to be like, did you memorize a square? Okay, here is a very typical TEAS question about the periodic table. Okay, which of the elements shown below would be least likely to react and form a compound with an element in group 1? Got 4 choices. And the correct answer is A, neon. I think you'll see right away that like if you memorized the whole periodic table, like that wouldn't help you answer this question. You need to know very specific things about the periodic table, and you need to know very specific things about like how the elements interact with each other. Okay, for example, to answer this question, you need to recognize that neon is one of a group of elements that we call the noble gases. You should know what the noble gases are. You should know what they do and what they don't do. We often call them the kings or the queens of the periodic table, and you should know why. So if you learn all that, it will be very, very obvious why A is the right answer. So you could spend hours and days and weeks memorizing the periodic table. It would like never prepare you to get this question right. So you got to make sure that you're learning the specific things. Don't listen to anyone who says, "Oh yeah, memorize a whole periodic table." Stay away from them. Okay. All right. The next key topic: dissolving and solubility. Which of the following compounds would be most soluble in water? And it is A, C2H5OH. There are few things to look out for in a chemical formula that tell you that chemical would be soluble in water, that it could dissolve in water. One of those keys is an OH, and we see that here in this chemical formula. It's one clue that chemical can dissolve in water. Also, if you've learned this list of chemicals that you need to know for the TEAS, you might recognize that C2H5OH is ethanol, also known as drinking alcohol. It's like in drinks like beer and wine, it's the alcohol that you drink. And so obviously if you recognize this as ethanol or drinking alcohol, you know, yeah, it's soluble in water. Of course it can dissolve in water. So just one more reason to make sure that, you know this small list of chemicals for the TEAS, because it'll really help you with questions like this. Okay, our last topic is Le Chatelier's principle. Now, this is part of a topic called equilibrium. You really don't need to know much of other equilibrium topics for the TEAS. You really just need to know Le Chatelier's principle. So sometimes people reach out to me and they're like, you only talk about Le Chatelier's principle. Like, why don't you talk about equilibrium in general? It's like, the only thing about equilibrium that you need to know is this topic called Le Chatelier's principle. Now, maybe you've never heard of equilibrium. Maybe you've never heard of Le Chatelier's principle. Well, totally fine. Here's the thing. The TEAS loves it. I don't know why. It shows up on the TEAS all the time. Some people think it's a really advanced topic. But I still cover it. I still put it in my like essential things to know for the TEAS. And one of those reasons is because it's very common on the TEAS. And some people think it's like complex and confusing. I don't think it's complex and confusing. I do think that like many books and videos are terrible at teaching it. And so I think people get really confused when they try to watch, some random, video on YouTube. It's probably just like confusing people even more. But I have a video on this. I think I can break it down in like 20 minutes. And after you watch that, you can be prepared for like basically any question that the TEAS is going to throw you on this. And for whatever reason, like this topic, the TEAS just loves it and it shows up all the time. So let's take a look at an example of a question. Maybe you've never seen questions like this before, but like now they're part of this topic called Le Chatelier's principle, and now you know what to study. Okay, The reaction, and then they give you a chemical equation here, is exothermic. Which condition would result in an increase in the rate of the reverse reaction? Okay, give it a shot. And the answer is C, increasing the temperature. Now, if you know how this works, you can answer this question like super fast, okay? I'll walk you through it, okay? I'm not going to be teaching it from scratch. That takes longer to learn. But like, if you sort of know a little bit of this in the back of your head, maybe this will refresh your memory. Okay. The question tells us that the reaction is exothermic. And that means that we can write heat as a product. We write it over here. Now, if we raise the temperature, since heat is a product, the reaction will move in reverse to use up the heat and cool things back down. So that's choice C. All the other choices, A, B, and D, are things that would make the reaction move in the forward direction. So we don't want to choose those. If you've never learned this stuff about Le Chatelier's principle and equilibrium, I can teach it to you in like 20, 25 minutes. And you could probably tell that I just love teaching this stuff and making it crystal clear. So check out my videos. I really think they'll help. TEASIN1day.com. Okay, so once you learn all these high priority topics that we talked about, you're in a really good place. When you can easily and confidently answer questions like the ones that we saw, you have your first step covered. The most important topics, you've got those in the bag. Now, depending on what score you need, these basic essentials might be all that you need, right? A couple hours, you'll be all set. Now, if you want to try and raise your score as much as possible, then after you master the basics, you can move on to the more advanced topics. These are the other topics. They're a little harder to learn. They show up less often, but if you really want a high score, you'll need to venture in this direction. For many students, the basics are all you need. Okay, but look, no matter what score you want, you need to have a strategy and a plan, okay? Skimming through every book and watching every video out there it's like a sure way to learn absolutely nothing and waste your time. As I always say, my TEAS Chemistry Essentials, my course will take you step by step through all the stuff that we just talked about. I try to make the material crystal clear, even for people who've never taken a chemistry class. So I think it's awesome. I think it's better than anything else out there. I would love for you to just check it out. You can start learning for free. If you like it, you can get the whole thing. If you don't like it, you can like never watch another one of my videos ever. But you can find all of my stuff at TEASIN1day.com. You can start learning totally for free. I think you'll watch my stuff. I think you'll feel yourself learning. And if you've got any questions about the chemistry, about the TEAS, about the, my course or whatever, just send me an email, Tyler@TEASIN1day.com. I'd love to hear from you. I love to answer your questions. I love to help whenever I can. So best of luck on the TEAS. Best of luck studying. I hope this video is helpful. And I hope my other stuff that's out there on YouTube and my website is helpful for you too. Best of luck on the TEAS.